Good evening, everybody. My name is Sebastian Einsiedel. I am the director of the Center for Policy Research here at UNU. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation series event with one of Japan's leading policy thinkers, Takashi Shiraishi, about one of Japan's leading policy institutions, GRIPS, the Graduate Policy, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies.
Yeah.
So you've all seen his CV. I just want to remind you that Professor Shiraishi has been serving as GRIPS president since 2011, but he has been associated with the institution for longer. Prior to joining GRIPS, he has taught at some of the best universities in the US and Japan, including Cornell, from where he also got his PhD, and the universities of Kyoto and Tokyo. But you also got your hands dirty in the real world, having served in the Japan government's cabinet office for a few years, from 2009 to 2012.
Yeah, right.
It's great to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Now, we are not going to focus tonight on your academic area of expertise, which is East Asian politics and East Asian geopolitics, but we're going to focus on GRIPS. And GRIPS is a very interesting institution and is also a rather unique institution in Japan. It is a bit of a hybrid outfit. It is both a policy think tank, and it is a graduate public policy school. And so I thought maybe to start out, you could tell the audience members who are not deeply familiar with GRIPS a little bit about the institution.
Yeah, thank you. Well, GRIPS has three major sort of functions or missions. One is, of course, educational. This is a graduate school of policy studies to train middle career officials, both from Japan as well as from abroad, for PhD and MA level training. The second mission is offering all the kinds of training courses, but now I'm sort of focusing more on short executive courses for senior government officials, both from Japan as well as from abroad. And the final part, as you mentioned, is think tank part. This is probably the least developed yet. We have been doing a lot of projects, research projects, but I rather want to see this part to get into institutionalized and develop think tank, institutional think tank mechanism there. But maybe I can talk about it later.
Terrific. Maybe we start out by talking a little bit about GRIPS' role as a public policy school. Now, some of the audience members may be familiar with the very well-known US public policy schools along the lines of which GRIPS seems to be at least partly modeled, like the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, SAIS at Johns Hopkins, SIPA at Columbia, etc. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit how GRIPS is alike and how is it different from those schools in the US?
One major difference probably is GRIPS is not really admitting any new students, those people who have just graduated from any university. We require students, all the applicants to have at least 5-year work experience. And more than 90%, I would say, of GRIPS students currently are mid-career officials. So in that sense, we are not really interested in those people who want to join the government, but rather we are the institution where mid-career officials will be educated for senior positions. That is actually one sort of difference. The other difference is, certainly, Kennedy School or CSIS in DC are really, I would say, far ahead of us, in terms of funding, in terms of rotation, but at least we are trying to combine this, public policy, especially economic policy side, with science and technology policy, and also foreign policy. So we have three different, major pillars as programs for training students. And also, we are focusing really on Asia Pacific. And the current sort of objective for us is to make GRIPS as one of the sort of, premier policy schools in Asia Pacific. Because, frankly speaking, Kennedy School is still far, far ahead. And therefore, I don't think, we can compete right now. But who knows, 10 years from now, right?
Excellent. Now, one rather unique feature of GRIPS in Japan is its highly international student body. If I'm not mistaken, I think 2/3 of your students are actually from overseas. Now I wonder, in more general terms, how well is Japan doing in attracting foreign students, and how important is that for Japan's soft power?
Well, certainly, it is very important. Actually, in a book I published with my wife 4 years ago, we actually talked about, it's about the rise of China, and we sort of, came up with a new word which we coined Anglo-Chinese. That means those Chinese who are trained in Anglo-Saxon educational institutions, and speak and dream and think in English. And actually, that is a kind of Japanese we also need for this country, and therefore I'm calling for the training Anglo-Japanese along with Anglo-Chinese and other Anglos. And in the case of GRIPS, actually we have about 400 students. 2/3 are indeed from abroad, and 1/3 from Japan. As I said, we are really focusing on Asia-Pacific region. So probably out of 2/3, that means 260, 270 students. Currently, probably almost 200 are from Asia-Pacific. And these people are all, trained in English, and we have area specialists too, so they can interact with each other very well.
Great. Now, I'm curious, coming in educational terms from the US, as GRIPS president, how much attention do you pay to university rankings? And in that context, how concerned are you that Japanese universities seem to have slipped lately in the Asian rankings a little bit?
Well, GRIPS is not like any other, especially big universities like University of Tokyo, Kyoto University, and so on. And I frankly don't care much about GRIPS international ranking. But it doesn't mean that I don't pay attention to it. I actually pay attention especially to the international ranking of economics faculty. Because, Penn University, University of Penn has their own, sort of international ranking of economic departments all over the world. And if you look at this ranking, GRIPS is, last year, I haven't really looked at it this year, but last year we are number 2. Number 1 was University of Tokyo. We are number 2. But, in a few years, I'm very sure we will be number 1 because I, in fact, headhunted some of the big stars from University of Tokyo. That is the easiest way to overtake it. So, in that sense, we, of course, look at international ranking. But in the case of, big universities, I'm not really sure whether this is a right way of think about improving Japanese universities. I mean, without relying on, without trying to improve their ranking, there are so many things you have to do. And so, I mean, better put your own resources, scarce resources, in certain things which are more strategic rather than trying to improve international ranking. That is actually my position.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you have a number of partner institutions in both China and South Korea, and you also have
as
a
well as Southeast Asia.
sizable student body from those two countries. And I just wonder in this context, how important is academic cooperation in broader efforts to improve relations with your neighbors?
Well, actually, in that respect, I would think that our cooperation, especially MOUs with top-class educational institutions in Southeast Asia, is more rewarding than, for example, I mean, Chinese and Korean institutions. I mean, for example, we have a memorandum of understanding with China's Central Party School, and I regularly visit the Central Party School, exchange opinions with Vice President of Central Party School, because President is Xi Jinping himself. But we don't really get good students from these people, because they are very sort of careful about the kind of people they send. But in the case of Southeast Asia, we are really getting very good students from those institutions with whom we work together. And now there are a number of proposals from Australian universities, American universities, and so on. So hopefully this will also translate into recruiting, getting good students from these institutions.
Great. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the think tank role of GRIPS. According to one recent count, there are 108 think tanks in Japan, which makes Japan the country with the 9th largest number of think tanks in the world. Now, I wonder, how does GRIPS fit into the think tank scene here, and how influential are think tanks in Japan anyway?
Well, I mean, actually, I also serve as president of IDE, Institute of Developing Economies, JETRO, and this is definitely the foremost think tank on developing countries. And I, in fact, encourage all these people, I mean, research staff, interact with government officials, especially Cabinet Office, Prime Minister's Office, METI, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on. And in the case of GRIPS, it's slightly different, because for now, all the sort of projects are given to individual faculty members, and of course, GRIPS obtain, and get overhead. But otherwise, it's entirely those faculty members to do whatever projects they want to do with other other think tanks or with government agencies. So, I mean, for that, I mean, actually, we are doing think tank job, but not exactly institutionally. What is actually the kind of possibility I now see is there are a lot of requests from government agencies, whether we are interested in establishing this type of think tank or this or that type of think tank. And in fact, we have already established what we call CIREX Center. That is actually think tank, especially for Cabinet Office and Ministry of Education in the field of science, technology, and innovation policy. And we are working very closely with Cabinet Office and Ministry of Education, because one thing we can do is actually the kind of, we can analyze data to make options available for government agencies. And that kind of work is not publicly, quite often not publicly published, but we ensure the very close interactions with government officials and our faculty members, as well as people from outside. So, I mean, that part, I think, it's a bit difficult to explain. But, I mean, still it's developing. And probably in 5 years, you will see starting number of, small think tank affiliated with GRIPS being already there and doing research on, say, science and technology policy, on university reform policy, all the policies about aging society, and so on.
Let me dig into this a little deeper and put it in broader context. I wonder whether you could tell us what is distinct about policy-making process in Japan, and especially compared to the US. So is there something in Japan like a policy community, a policy discourse that is comparable to the United States, where there is a vivid exchange between government, think tanks, academia, NGO, and business? And the reason I'm asking is because I happened to fall on an article that you wrote a few years ago, almost 10 years ago now, in the journal American Interest, in which you expressed the hope that GRIPS may be able to soften a bit the rigid institutional barriers in Japan that seem to be making that vivid exchange somewhat difficult.
Well, let me put it this way. In the American system, those policymakers, say, who worked under President Clinton, once, President Bush came to power, moved out. And many of them worked for think tanks.
The revolving door.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. But here, if you become government official, you stay government official for life. If you join academic institutions, you remain academics for life. And why I am actually one of the very few exceptions, because I in fact worked as regular member, executive member of a council in the cabinet office. But most of the time that doesn't happen, and that means you have to come up with a different way of ensuring interactions between academics and sort of public intellectuals and government officials, and if possible, parliamentary members too. And GRIPS these days have been giving venue for these people to gather together regularly, exchange opinions, and quite often this is quite useful to create a kind of policy consensus. And that is actually one of the functions I think I have achieved over the last 5 years.
Yeah, excellent. Let's talk about money for a second. GRIPS is, I think, slightly over 50% funded by the Japanese government. I wonder, to what degree does this affect the independence of GRIPS, that they rather heavily rely on the contributions from one government? And I also wonder to what degree you're affected by any financing constraints experienced by the Japanese government as of late.
Well, this is a very important and, in a sense, crucial question for anyone who runs a university in Japan now. Because, GRIPS as well as other national universities, and our budget is cut by 1% a year until last year. And then starting this year being cut by 1.4 or 1.6%. And that actually long term really squeezes our resources. And so that is a big challenge. And I'll come back to it, how to deal with it. The other part, because the government, universities are dependent on government funding, GRIPS dependent on the government funding, are we constrained? No. Actually, the government is very careful not to make any intervention in any educational or research projects. So that part we don't need to worry about. Academic freedom is entirely ensured. But coming back to the original, funding part, certainly this in fact underlines the importance of offering short executive courses, because that is where money is. And we are expanding these short executive courses over the last 5 years. 5 years ago, we only trained about 2,000 officials. Last year, we accepted about 3,500. But, demand is there. Many ask requests. And so I have been very choosy these days. And for example, with Vietnam, we only accept 50 senior officials. Deputy ministers, director general for 2 weeks, and then they get all the training. And, we did that for the last 2 years. This year, some of them made it into the Politburo. In Thailand, we have been doing the training for vice provincial governors. Now, our graduates occupy about 1/3 of Thai provincial governors. So that's the kind of, courses we do. And on the one hand, we make money. At the same time, we actually create a very close networks with these people.
Interesting. Now, let me use this as an opportunity to return a bit to your educational and training vocation. There is a bit, again, coming back to the US as a contrast, there's a bit of a debate in the US on whether public policy schools are imparting the right skills to their graduates. And there is a bit of a debate on whether they're maybe too focused on quantitative methods, on data, whether they're too focused on global and national problems at the expense of more local level problems, whether they're maybe too academic in orientation and too divorced from real life challenges, whether they're not sufficiently attuned to the importance of public-private partnership approaches to solving today's problems, and especially in terms of business background. So I wonder whether there is a bit of a similar debate, and what skills you think are particularly important for public servants to learn while at GRIPS.
This is a very important but tough question. I always talk about the kind of tyranny of disciplines. Because, if you attend or you teach at any top-level universities, whether in the United States or in Japan, you tend to, your faculty members tend to focus very closely and narrowly on their own disciplines. And as a result, quite often I hear from both Japanese and American policymakers that, for example, those who majored in political science or international relations are not really useful for foreign policy as foreign policy specialists. And so when I actually joined, started working as president of GRIPS, one thing I really tried to do is to create a kind of space in which economists, political scientists, area specialists, and so on can talk with each other and encourage these people to interact with each other, as well as former senior government officials. So for now, we have about 80 faculty members. 1/3 are former government officials. And some of these former government officials co-teach courses with economists, political scientists, so that there are always a kind of interaction. I'm not saying that they have achieved the kind of the level of interaction I aimed at, but at least the process has started. And so, for example, normally, economists and political science cannot talk with each other because they have different language, different categories, different way of looking at things. But if you you run a joint research project long enough, then these people start talking with each other.
My last question to you is, you have entered your last year at GRIPS. You will be replaced, I think, by April of 2017 by Professor Akihiko Tanaka, who until recently was the head of JICA and is now returned to his alma mater, the University of Tokyo. What advice will you give him on where to take GRIPS in the long term?
Do whatever he wants. I'm happy to give the power, to Professor Tanaka, and I'm really looking forward to stepping down from the job. And I will never interested in running any institution anymore. Having said that, I think, given the kind of position GRIPS now occupies, I think it is very important to make GRIPS as an important policy score in Asia Pacific and hopefully beyond in the coming years.
Very interesting. Now, unfortunately, we have come to an end of a very interesting and very refreshing conversation, I thought. Now, despite your apparent enthusiasm for the prospect of not running things in the future, your enthusiasm for actually running and leading GRIPS is palpable, and I think you've had a remarkable term. From where we sit, GRIPS is a shining star at the firmament of Japanese think tanks and educational institutions. It's been a great pleasure to have you here, great honor. Thank you very much for joining us. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.